Here Comes Pod is back, and we have an amazing guest to start 2022. Michael Grindon's entertainment career spans Time Life, HBO, and Legendary Entertainment, but he's best known for his 25-year stint at Sony Pictures, much of which was spent as president of international television. Michael talks about his early days at HBO and the excitement of starting a new sales operation at Legendary, but we mainly focus on his time at Sony, where he not only took an existing content distribution operation and grew it into a multi-billion-dollar revenue line for the studio, but also achieved the hardest task in corporate life by building not one but two businesses for Sony, a global channels business and an international production operation. It was a pleasure to catch up with Michael, and I hope you enjoy the chat as well. Hi Michael, welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Danny. Nice to see you. Nice to be here again.
Great to have you. I always start with a fun question. So my question to you is this. You're invited to play in an exhibition match at your tennis club, and you're going to play against a member who you've played against many times before, and you know that he's quite good, but you also find out that he's bringing as a partner in this doubles competition somebody who's really good, like really, really top level. And so you have to decide who your partner's going to be. Now, if you had the opportunity to invite to be your partner anybody in the history of tennis, who would you choose?
You know, Pete Sampras would be a good choice. He'd have a great serve, still a fantastic doubles player. And no, that'd be great fun. And I've actually hit on the court with Pete Sampras once or twice. That was probably a good time.
Okay, well, it wasn't even a hypothetical question. So that's great. You started out in the entertainment business actually at Time Life Films, but even before that, were you a big film and TV fan when you were younger? Was this a business that you had a big calling to be part of?
No, I don't think so. I enjoyed going to the movies with my parents and friends like everybody else did. And I think I probably watched an average amount of television, but there was certainly no passion to get into that business. I worked in a few different businesses. I worked for a large engineering firm for a while, and I went to business school thinking that would give me an opportunity to choose something interesting to do. When I really sat down and reflected on it and thought about what I wanted to do, I realized that the entertainment business was a really exciting place to work in. And I focused with a couple of other friends at Harvard Business School on ways to get into the entertainment business. And we essentially convinced Columbia Pictures at the time to let us work as a market study group for them and do a market study on the new, at the time, VCR business. Remember, in 1980, when this was occurring, you were looking at Laserdisc, Betamax, VCR, trying to figure out what the format was and how fast it was going to grow. And we had the opportunity to interview people at a number of different firms, studios and such around the country, and came up with a pretty interesting study. And that worked well. And so pretty much everybody in my group ended up migrating towards the entertainment business, including me. Time Life Films at the time was an interesting choice because they were going to make movies to try to bring to HBO, but their business plan was frankly not well thought out. And shortly after I arrived there, they cut back and said, look, why don't you go over to HBO? And I said, great. And I interviewed with one of their new managers, a guy named Jeff Bucas. And Jeff was his usual, somewhat sarcastic, but really brilliant self. And it was great fun to work for him. We had a great time. And he was a terrific boss and a great leader, and obviously did a great job at not only HBO, but Time Warner, and navigating them to a very successful conclusion with their AT&T buyout. So smart guy.
What was HBO like at that time?
It was a frantic pace, very exciting, lots of fun. It's hard to kind of imagine work quite as exciting as it was at that time. But it was really when I joined in 1980, a very distribution-focused business. If you remember, we really hadn't done any original programming at the time, but they were packaging sports and movies. And the real drive was to build a business and grow it as quickly as possible. There was a brilliant team there. Tony Cox, the guy who ran the distribution organization, was fantastic. Frank Biondi, a great business guy who was great at acquiring content. Michael Fuchs, who did a lot of work there. The original scene at HBO, it was, frankly, it had a certain frat house quality to it at the time because people would work late on weekends. But Time Inc. was very generous in the fact that they said anything that you went out and did with an employee, if you went to dinner, if you went to breakfast on the weekend, was paid for by the company. So you were pretty much motivated to go out with a lot of fellow employees. You worked hard, you played hard. But on the other hand, it was very successful and the team was brilliant. And it was a terrific place to learn because when you're working with really smart people and really smart managers, you learn a lot from them. So I worked for a guy named Bill Rohde, who managed MTV for many years and did a great job with them. Obviously, Tony Cox, Frank Biondi, Linda Frankenbach, the other people I worked with were fantastic and great mentors for me. So it turned out to be a terrific experience for 6 years. It was a lot of fun.
And at one point, Gary Morenzi turned up on the
Gary Morenzi, who was my summer intern from Stanford. I think Gary had a good time there too, but didn't end up coming back to the company. I think he went directly to Columbia Pictures out of business school.
And then talking of Columbia Pictures, you joined there in 1986. Was it very exciting to be on the lot the first day?
Well, when I joined Columbia Pictures, I joined in New York in our offices, which were in the Coca-Cola building on Fifth Avenue. So for 4 years, I worked in New York, which was for international television, international distribution, was a much better place to work because our primary markets were still in Europe. Once Sony had acquired us, they wanted us all back in Los Angeles. But I very much enjoyed working in New York. New York was a great place to work and a very exciting place at the time.
And what were you doing then in those early days in the sort of 86 to 90 era?
The international business was very small at the time. Our total annual revenues were about $60 million the first year I was there, and that expanded to about $2 billion about 25 years later. So it was a pretty healthy growth curve. I have to say my timing was very, very good. 1986 was kind of an explosive year. And so I came in very quickly. The other advantage was my immediate boss. I was only there for a few months before he was transferred out to LA to run the television group. And he basically handed the group to me and said, here, go do it. And I was partnered with Nick Bingham, who was running our London and international operations. So Nick and I quickly became good partners and had a great time running the business.
And so what did that business look like in that period? You know, was it movie sales? Was it reruns of Bewitched? What was selling?
Our primary business was definitely movies. Columbia had a great library of movies, but the current films were not particularly impressive. David Putnam had just come in to run the studio. He had some visions about changing Hollywood, and he wasn't terribly successful in those endeavors. So most of the movies he made were not commercially successful. So we were primarily selling our library films. We had a number of successful television series through the acquisition of Embassy Television. But again, most of those were sitcoms. Columbia was not a great seller of dramas at the time. So managing our portfolio was a tricky business because while we had plenty of content to sell, it wasn't the most popular content.
So 1995, you took over as president of International TV. What was your to-do list like?
With distribution, we wanted to be among the most important suppliers to our clients around the world. And that meant we wanted to supply a full panorama of content, which was really movies being the most important, television series, which were fine for them. But in addition, we wanted to provide content that we thought would work for them in prime time, which movies, of course, did. But television series were still usually relegated to the weekends or late night or off-peak hours. So we started to look very seriously at doing local language production, which was a key that we thought would allow us to be not only a supplier of important content, but also a producer of content, which allowed you to appeal to the client in a much different way because you were talking about new product that they could commission on their own. And our way into that business was to use formats for things that we could build and build off of. So bringing on production was another key part of our distribution. The other key points for us was filling out some of our distribution. We opened a few other offices. We built out our team so we could have local players in all these territories. We thought we wanted to be number one in terms of servicing our clients, and we were very effective in that regard. And that meant even having local players in places like India and others, which were not really doing a lot of business, but establishing offices in Russia, India, and other players allowed us to grow and really open up new markets that had not been accessed much more aggressively before. South Korea was another interesting place where building out an office allowed us to do much better in terms of sales and distribution.
I was there in 2001. I'm sure you recall this, when Sir Howard Stringer said that Sony was getting out of the network TV business, but it kind of got misreported in a way that Sony were getting out of the TV business. And how did you feel at that particular moment? I know how I felt, but from your point of view, did you suddenly think we're in trouble here for that side of the business, which was a growing part of actually international licensing? If you look at some of the other studios, a lot of their growth came from licensing very successful US network TV, for example.
No, it was very important. Network television was very important and becoming much more important to international broadcasters as well. The difficult part about that quote from Howard was, I think he was rather misquoted. If I could interpret a little better, what he meant to say is, we're no longer going to do any stupid deals for network television. We had done several deals recently in the past, which were not very profitable. And we had just done a very long and detailed look at the network business. And by that time, it was clear that the networks were producing more content on their own. Once the financial syndication rules had faded at the end of the 90s, you really had the networks obviously taking more control of their content and making it much more difficult for the studios to supply them with effectively network series. So take Howard's quote as saying, really, we're not going to do any more stupid deals. And most of us realized, fine, we're not going to do those deals. But we quickly moved into producing for cable, which is a very growing business. I think our first production at that time was The Shield, which turned out to be a very effective drama for us as well. And that built, again, a big cable business. And it wasn't long before we were able to move back into that network business, but it was on a different scale and one which was much smarter. So we had to kind of go out to all of our clients and say, yes, we're still producing television, and yes, we'll still produce drama and comedy, but it won't necessarily be for the networks that won't pay us a fair amount for our content.
You mentioned that synergy between the international productions side of things and its role within the overall distribution side of the business. But that was in effect a reimagining of the role of a US studio. And it's something that people have played catch up with. I think Sony was very much in the vanguard of that. Was it daunting? Was it very exciting to be going to lots of different countries and quite diverse countries? It's one thing to set up a production operation in Germany or the UK or Spain. It's another to set up an operation in India or Russia, for example. So exciting, daunting, challenging. What was that like?
Yes, I'd add all three of those objectives: exciting, daunting, and challenging, but really energizing, because again, you were having different conversations with the networks about content that they wanted to produce that would make a big difference for their business. You know, Russia's an interesting example. One of our first productions there was simply taking The Nanny, which was a very successful sitcom, adapting that for Russia. And it turned out to be a huge hit for one of the networks. And they were eager to commission more content for us. We took a soap opera called Betty LaFea, a Colombian soap opera, and in an interesting discovery, realized that the writer of the soap opera was Russian and lived in Colombia, where he created the series. We contacted him because we knew where it was and what he was doing, and asked him if he'd like to come to Russia and translate it and build it into a business in Russian. He said, that's a terrific idea. Why not? He built a show that allowed, I think, the fourth or fifth rated network. Betty LaFea was stripped along the evening at a time, and they were going from a roughly 3 or 4% share to a 30% share every night when Betty LaFea was playing. That network was able to go public based on the effectiveness of that show over 6 months' time and their revenues, which just went through the stratosphere. So it was incredibly successful. But the reason is we were able to bring technology, we were able to bring expertise, which wasn't there in Russia. We were able to adapt it with some of the local culture and use the international connections that we had to be able to really help build that business. Now, we weren't able necessarily to stay ahead of everybody. The other production companies learned what we were bringing to the table. But in many cases, we were able to do something really different and unique. And that allowed us to make a lot of money. In fact, we should have bought stock in the television company that went public.
So the other part of the international TV lineup was the channels business. And again, that was something that internationally was, I guess, tiny or virtually non-existent when you took over, and then grew to, I think, 122 channels in about 140 countries. So what was the thinking about moving into the channels business for a studio that didn't have a US network, which was something that was a little bit of a differentiator from some of the other studio competitors who did have either US network or US cable operations to kind of leverage off?
I think when Sony first acquired Columbia Pictures, they would have liked to have acquired a US network or perhaps a cable network, but they were, of course, concerned about the rules that foreign networks couldn't really own US property. So that was one problem. And another one was they just didn't really see the sort of right place at the right time. They were interested in a few networks, but there wasn't anything coming along that they felt was financially reasonable. And also, at Columbia, we were very much aware that we had missed the boat when you looked at successful services like HBO and Showtime. They had really built their business off the feature films from the motion picture studios. And the motion picture studios realized later that they'd been asleep at the switch, allowing those very, very successful US pay TV operations to grow. So they were much more cognizant in international operations to say, I don't want to just license my movies. I'd also like to be part owner so I can share in the profits of those. It was interesting when I first got there, I saw a memo in the file that they had, Columbia had an opportunity to invest in Canal Plus early on, but they had decided not to do so. That was a little bit before my time. And I brought that back up to management and said, look, we missed the boat here. We need to take advantage of these operations. And the first one we really had an opportunity was in Latin America, where HBO was starting up their business. And we went to them and said, look, we want to invest in the business. We want to build a business with you. And that was kind of the first area we were able to build in. And that we quickly saw that our very minimal investment there was returning profits and paying itself off within a year or two. And so we replicated that model in HBO Asia, HBO Europe. I think that was certainly the start. What we had never really done was thought about building a local language channel till around 1995. Mel Harris, who was president of the television group at the time, and I went to India, and we knew that that was a big growth business. We talked to a number of advertisers, all said, look, we don't have enough venues to reach people. It's very important that we have new venues. We need new channels. We eventually found a group of 7, actually, Indian businessmen who controlled a library of content, and they became our local partners where Sony could own a majority of the business. They helped us really understand the Indian market in a way that was unique, and we really brought a lot of the expertise to launch and put together a channel. Our effective launch, I think, cost about $50 million in total to put that business together, which seems like a paltry sum at this time, but in 1996, 97 was still 95 when we launched, I think was still a pretty significant number. Within 5 years, we had a valuation of $2 billion. Pretty exciting.
Did you become a fan of cricket on the back of it?
The gut feeling was if we had cricket rights, we would be on the map like nobody else, and we could compete with anybody in the marketplace. And I went to my boss, Mel Harris, again, and said, Mel, here's a real opportunity. We've launched this channel. We're building our business. Now we can get cricket rights, and we could be the number one channel while we have cricket rights. And he looked at me and said, you must be crazy. There's nobody in this company, not in Japan or in the US, who would want to spend $200 million on cricket rights. The good news was Sony had promoted Howard Stringer to be head of North America by that time. And asked Mel if he would mind if I went to see Howard and talk to him about it. And when I talked to Howard, who was a big cricket fan, I said, Howard, we could get Indian cricket rights. He said, that's a fantastic idea. Do it. And with really not much more than that, he convinced Sony to fund it. And we bought the cricket rights, and that really put us on the map, allowed us to compete with anybody in the market, and turned out to be an extremely profitable investment.
So Howard gave cricket with one hand and took network TV away with the other. In a way.
Yeah, Howard had his moments of great inspiration. He was always a very fun guy to work with.
So you had a very long run at Sony Pictures. And then the next role that you had was really, I suppose, starting again to energize another content company with Legendary. Was it exciting to start a new distribution operation and to sort of get into the detail again?
It was exciting. Legendary was exciting. I wanted to get a little closer to working in the content business. While I was doing the international business, I was pretty much removed from staying close to the individual productions in any case, just because managing the operation was a pretty big one. So the opportunity of Legendary Television came up, and that was one that had a very interesting possibility because I thought it was a small group of people. So instead of working for a large company, I was going to work for a guy named Bruce Rosenblum, who I knew a lot. He'd run Warner Brothers Television for a long time, but also meeting Thomas Tull. Thomas just had this vision of building a big business. He'd been very successful in building a feature film business with Warner Brothers over time, and he was ready to do it again in the television world. And he had some interesting executives there with Bruce, and we started building a television business. The other really interesting thing was, with all the new digital tools that were on the horizon, I realized that you could build a television business with a very small group of 15 to 20 people operating a business, especially if you didn't have a giant library to manage and you were working out on new content. You could do it with a very small team. So that was the fun, challenging part. Do something new, very low cost, that could be very effective dealing with new content. And yes, that was exciting, and it was fun doing it. And while Thomas was there, it was great. And I'd say our television business was very successful. We had some terrific series, and it was fun being close to the series, working on casting, reading all the scripts. Working on that was a very different kind of approach for us. And I was able to convince some old friends like John McMahon to come and work, and others. So it was great fun.
Looking back, is there something that you would pick as a career highlight?
Well, one that we mentioned, I thought, was India. That was a very interesting place where we really had to be creative, innovative. We learned a lot. We made mistakes, but we overcame, I thought, a great deal of resistance in building a very successful and fantastic business for Sony. There was one other thing, which was just more in the deal-making range, which was a complicated one, but I was running the US pay TV operation while I was running international. And Columbia had long time been a supplier of content to HBO and Showtime. And I had been approached by John C., who was at Stars at the time, or really Encore at the time. And he wanted to create this new pay TV channel called Stars. And he needed a major studio to make a commitment for a significant period of time. And we worked out a very unusual deal for Stars. It's a pretty revolutionary pay TV deal at the time, and one that was very, very rewarding for Columbia Pictures in a lot of ways, and created, again, a whole new pay TV business, which was Stars, which has, continued to be pretty successful over time. So I looked on both of those and said, those were very creative, interesting, difficult challenges that took, months to achieve. But I look back on it as being a big part of success, of my personal success, and great successes for Sony at the time. So they were both a lot of fun, great to work on.
And what would be the biggest lesson you'd pass on to the next generation if you were asked to impart all this knowledge and experience? What would be the one thing that you would emphasize to perhaps executives coming through?
I think most of my success was because I was working with very smart people, very accomplished people, quite frequently people far more accomplished and smarter than I was. I had the good sense to hire people who were smarter than I was, and work for people who were brilliant. Not always necessarily ones that would show you the way, but ones that would give you the leeway to make mistakes and help you correct and learn from those mistakes. I just had the great fortune to work with great bosses, Jeff Bucas, Mel Harris, even Peter Goober in his own way was really quite a creative and interesting dynamo, and you'd learn a lot from them. So working for those kind of brilliant people, really, it's easy to learn and see what they're doing and add more of your own expertise to that, but really build that expertise. And so I'd say if you're looking again at a company, find a company with smart people, hopefully a business you're interested in and things that you can learn from, but find people who can mentor you and people who can teach you, and then quickly try to surround yourself with other smart people. And it's pretty hard not to be successful under those kind of circumstances.
Well, this is the moment in the podcast where I ask my guests for their lockdown film, book, music choice, and TV box set. And there have been various moments where I've said, in case we find ourselves in another lockdown, and the likelihood of that has gone up and down depending on the time frame. It feels like we hopefully are moving a little bit away from that, but there are plenty of places where it feels like those restrictions might apply. So this, unfortunately, this part of the podcast still retains its resonance. And so it would be genuinely very interesting to get your thoughts on that, because it might just help someone to make some interesting choices.
I tried to think about my favorite film, one that I'd want to watch over and over. And frankly, there are so many. I love features, but there's one film that had kind of a special place in my heart, not only for the film, which I thought was absolutely fantastic, and I've certainly watched it at least a dozen times, but because of the moment in time when it came out. And that was the first Spider-Man movie that Sony did with, amazing results. The whole studio was energized by this. People were just walking on air. It made so much money for the studio, far more than they anticipated. It was the first time they were really venturing into that sort of comic book arena, and it had been a huge success, great casting, and it was a wonderful movie. And that brings always special memories back for that day and time when it was released. Very exciting.
Me too, actually, because that was actually around about the time that we were in LA for the LA screenings. And so it was an opportunity to really feel part of the success of the studio, physically being present, and to really feel that energy that you talked about. So I know exactly what you mean when you talk about that.
It was just electric. It was really exciting. That first weekend was amazing. For a book, lots of great books out there, interesting things to read. But if I had to sit there on the desert island and have that one book that I could reread over and over again, probably the book that had one of the biggest impacts on my life was the trilogy of The Lord of the Rings. My older brother gave it to me when I was about 10 years old, and I consumed those books and really, really enjoyed them. In fact, I became such a Tolkien fan. I had posters up in my room for years and years and reread them several times. And of course, tremendously enjoyed the feature films as well. But those books were magical and still pretty incredible. I could go back and reread those and have a great time anytime. Music gets to be a much tougher piece because there's lots of different genres and things that I like. But if there's one album that I've listened to over and over again and still resonates with me all the time, it's Kind of Blue, a jazz album, Miles Davis and Coltrane. And it's just a great piece. And you just can't help but smile when you listen to it. It's just so good. Trying to figure out a TV series. There's a million TV series I could watch. But if you're going to get stuck on a desert island, you'd have to have some comedy and some drama. So I'd probably do two. If there was a long book of comedy, I'd have all those Seinfeld episodes with me and I'd watch them over and over again. They're that fantastic. And for drama, I'd watch Game of Thrones. I think Game of Thrones is just such a wonderful series, imaginative, smart, interesting. That's a wonderful combination, in my opinion. So anyway, those are my opinions.
Very good. And you also managed to combine a bit of Sony and a bit of HBO. So you stayed true to the brand. It's fantastic. Well, Michael Grindon, thank you so much for being on the pod. I'm really pleased that you didn't choose Novak Djokovic as your partner, because he wouldn't have been able to get into the country. But to keep that tennis theme going, it's definitely been our advantage and my advantage to have you on the pod. And I hope everyone listens to it with enormous amount of love and they can do so on the net. So that's a great tennis combination.
Well, thanks, Danny. It was a nice opportunity to reminisce about some great times. Fun working with a lot of people, including yourself. And we'll look forward to other interesting partnerships in the future.